Welcome to the second part of this week's lecture, in which we talked about photography as an art form. We introduced pictorialism, and we will discuss photo-secession. In the first part, we learned that there are a couple of ways in which photographers try to promote photography as an art form. One was to create fictional scenes, meaning the scenes that didn't really exist in reality. Now, they did that either by constructing the scene itself or by combination printing, meaning two of the images will be taken in the same location, and then in the process of making a print, those two images will be combined into one. And we saw examples of Gustave Allegret, Ray Lander, Robinson. Then on the other hand, we had Emerson, who had the same goal in mind, which is to promote photography as an art form. However, the way he wanted to do that was the polar opposite than the first group of photographers. Emerson was interested in promoting photography as an art form by doing what photography does the best, which is capturing reality. However, one thing that he did, which was really fresh and really new, was to capture gestures. So his images don't look stiff at all. He used composition, lighting, the cropping of the image in order to emphasize those gestures that were anything but stiff. Now, all of those efforts were just the efforts of individual photographers, individual artists. There was no organized movement that tried to promote photography as an art form. And all of that was happening until, let's say, late 1880s or early 1890s. And then we talked about pictorialism, which is the first organized movement that tried to promote photography as an art form. What pictorialism did combined these two extremes in which photographers tried to promote idea of art photography. So those two extremes were creating fictional images and number two, recording reality. So combine that into one. And the images that we've seen were recorded, meaning the real photograph of the real situation was taken. But then in the process of making a print, that photograph was manipulated somehow. So it started to resemble either a drawing or a charcoal drawing. It didn't really look like a photograph per se as a print itself. So pictorialists were the one who really fetishized this print as the object of art. So in this world now, we are going to talk about Alfred Stieglitz, who is one of the most important figures in the history of photography, and he really changed the way we see photography. He's son of German immigrants. He was born in Hoboken, Jersey, in an upper middle class family. In 1881, he was sent to Germany to study mechanical engineering. However, shortly after, he transferred to study photography. At the age of 23, and this is one photograph that he took in 1887, he entered English Photographic Society Salon contest, in which the sole judge was Emerson, and he awarded Stieglitz the first prize for this photograph here, called The Great Joke. Now, what do you think the reason for Emerson giving the first prize to this photograph was? Now, he said, out of the thousands of photographs I had seen as a judge, Stieglitz's entry was the only one that was truly spontaneous. So that pretty much goes hand in hand in what Emerson tried to promote, right? It was this spontaneous, real life situation captured in the image. Now, all of the other images that he had seen were conventional images of very still nudes, of still lifes, landscapes, portraits, seascapes, everything that Emerson was trying to fight against. He was interested in the spontaneous, real life images, not anything that was posed or staged. So now Stieglitz, he was technically very savvy. His ambition was to render a perfect negative, which means negative that would maintain shadow and highlight details even in a very complex and challenging lighting situation, such as the one that we see here, right? So we still see details in the highlight and still see details in the shadow. Now, after winning this salon, Stieglitz received a lot of prizes for his work, and he exhibited his work all over Europe. He was pretty much unknown in the US until in 1990 when his sister died and he had to return back to New York. And now these are some of the images that he had taken. And let's just look at them and try to find a connecting thread. Now, by looking at the images, I'm interested, what are the images like? What do they have in common? What was new? And what was related to pictorialism? Now, let's go and analyze that a little bit more. Now, what was new was that Stieglitz portrayed innovative subject matter, which is urban life. We have never seen that so consistently before he started taking images. So urban life as a subject matter was something new. He also started using a handheld large format camera. That is the camera that I showed to you in class, the big camera on a tripod. Now he used a handheld large format camera. Before him, most photographers used large format cameras on a tripod, and professional photographers considered handheld cameras unworthy of producing art. They were thinking, when you handhold a camera, there cannot be such control as you can exhibit it when you put a camera on a tripod. Now, what he also started doing, which was also new, he started enlarging negatives. Before him, photographers made contact prints that were the same size as negatives they produced. What Stieglitz did, he took the original negative, enlarged it to make a larger positive image, and then made contact negative that could be used as matrix for larger positive prints. Another thing that he did, he started cropping images. He was no longer attached to the limitation of the full frame in terms of the shape of an image and what it represented. And this is one example. This is a final image that Stieglitz represented in his shows. And this is the original shot. So he decided to crop it and go with a cropped image. And also he started using these unusual shapes which were not the full frame shape. You can see how elongated this frame is. What was related to pictorialism? He was interested in making a perfect negative and a perfect print. Now, if you recall, pictorialists had a fetish for photographic print, and the print itself was a piece of art. And he was also making images that could have been a straightforward shot, right? Which is something that pictorialists were interested in. And if you recall the definition of pictorialism, it is a way to make straightforward shots. However, in the process of making print, you somehow manipulate that straight shot or that reality into a piece that will resemble other forms of art. Now, what was new with Stieglitz, that unlike pictorialists who hoped to transform reality and achieve artistry through different printing techniques, and if again you recall those images that we saw in the first part that kind of look like charcoal drawings, what Stieglitz was interested in was the idea of transforming reality through personal or subjective view of the world. Now, this may be a little tricky to understand, but I'm going to try to explain it a little bit more. Now, I'll give you an example of two photographers photographing the same event, right? So you go to a protest on the street. So both of these photographers bring back images that show two completely different views of that particular event. So to make it very simple, one photographer can show protesters screaming, in which the viewer would think that that was a very violent protest. But the other photographer can show protesters singing. So the viewer would think that it was a very peaceful event. Now, both of those photographers were correct because those images were taken in reality. However, the way they saw that reality was not the same. One photographer saw the event as a violent event, and one photographer saw the event as a peaceful, optimistic event. So what Stieglitz tried to promote here is the way we see the world is transformative enough. We have to have an opinion before we take the image. And this is one example in which he said, as he was taking the image, he said, I saw a driver tenderly caring for his steaming car horses in a snow-covered street, and it came to symbolize for me my own growing awareness that unless what we do is born in a secret feeling, there can be no fulfillment in life. So this was a revolutionary idea, taking photographs that don't only represent the obvious reality, which in this case was a driver tenderly caring for his steaming car horses, but a personal idea behind it, which in this case was fulfillment and happiness. Now, this idea planted a seed that would champion photography as an art form. So it's not necessarily about reality. It's about your personal view of that reality, which kind of transform it into your own view of that reality. Now, we saw the example of that trying to happen before with Southworth and Has. Difference between the conventional daguerreotype and the Southworth and Has daguerreotype was not so dramatic. However, what was very revolutionary that they thought of taking an image that went beyond just what we saw. They were interested in discovering the inner man. Now, the same thing here. We may look at the image and say, well, that's nothing revolutionary there. Anybody can take the shot. Yes, but we have to again put ourselves in the shoes of the time in which the photograph was taken. The time in which the majority of people, majority of photographers, thought that image represented the truth. And now Stiglitz was saying there is something beyond that. We can use photography as a mode for personal expression. I can tell you what my view of that place is. I can tell you what my view of that person is or the event is. Just like other forms of art did, right? So painting, everybody knows that it's a mode of personal expression. But photography, it was a huge struggle to be achieved as a mode of personal expression. So in that case, this idea of taking images that don't only represent the obvious reality, but a personal idea behind it, was really revolutionary. And I'll read you one quote. In the infancy of photography, as applied to the making of pictures, it was generally supposed that after the selection of the subject, the posing, lighting, exposure, and development, every succeeding step was purely mechanical, required little or no thought. Now, this was what conventionally people at that time and before that thought of photography was just kind of a mechanical tool. The result of this was the inevitable one of stamping on every picture thus produced the brand of mechanism and the crude stiffness. Within the last few years, and again, this is a quote from 1899, so he's talking about late 1890s. Within the last few years, or since the more serious of the photographic workers began to realize the great possibilities of the medium, lens, camera, plate, developing bath, printing process, and the like, are used by them simply as tools for the elaboration of their ideas, and not as tyrants to enslave and dwarf them, as had been the case. So this kind of shows how long was the process from the first combination print that we saw from 1857, which is the Great Wave. How long was that struggle for photography to be accepted as the art form, trying to put it in a place in which is going to be equal to other forms of art, which can be used as a mode for personal expression. And these are some of the Stiglitz's images that I want you to look at with this new view in mind, that he was making them as a mode for personal expression. Now, when Stiglitz returned to New York, which is in 1890s, there was a difference between a European photography scene in which Stiglitz flourished at that time, and then the American photographic scene. The European scene was filled with experimentation, excitement, vital. There were regular salons, which were shows, and competitions. However, in the US, at the same time, there were a lot of photo clubs that promoted traditional and unimaginative ideas, which again, there were nudes, portraits that were pretty stiff, landscapes, still lifes, and so forth. Now, Stiglitz and his supporters tried to break away from the conventions and push the idea that photography is an art form equal to other art forms. He wanted to promote the new vision in photography by infiltrating already existing photography clubs and society in the New York City. So he wanted to kind of work from the inside. In 1890, Stiglitz becomes a member of the Society of Amateur Photographers. In 1893, he volunteered to be an editor of their journal, American Amateur Photographer. In 1896, The Society of Amateur Photographers and the New York Camera Club, which were the two photographic clubs in New York, both bound to the old technical style of photography, merged to form the Camera Club of New York. And Stieglitz was elected vice president of the club. In 1897, the first issue of the club's magazine, called Camera Notes, was published. Now, interesting thing is that Stieglitz used this Journal of American Amateur Photographer and the magazine Camera Notes as tools to set a new standard for excellence both in the photographs they published and in the writing about photography. Until 1902, Camera Notes promoted his belief in photography as an art form by including articles on art and aesthetic next to prints by some of the leading photographers in Europe and the US. As the editor, he was able to select and publish works that were fresh and pictorial. Cliché subject matter and generic images that would not exhibit personal investment were slowly pushed out. So he pretty much used his influence as the editor to promote what he believed was art photography. Now, in addition to Camera Notes, Stieglitz also organized many photography exhibitions. Now, what was new about them was that membership in the Camera Club of New York did not guarantee acceptance to the show, which was the case before. So everybody who was member of the Camera Club of New York, everybody who would pay a fee, their work would be shown in the show. Now, he changed that, and the entries went through a rigorous selection process, and no prizes were awarded. Just by being part of the exhibition was an award big enough. And as an example, I'll give you an example of a Chicago salon in which almost 1,000 images were submitted, but only 118 images were accepted for the show in that salon. And the title was New American School of Photography. And slowly, Stieglitz's ambition was to establish an American photographic identity that was lagging behind European. He wanted to gather photographers that have unique vision and present them to the world. In 1902, the conservative part of the Camera Club of New York forced Stieglitz to resign as an editor in Camera Notes. Shortly after, National Arts Club offered Stieglitz one of the rooms to hang an exhibition of pictorial photographs, and the show was titled An Exhibition of American Pictorial Photography Arranged by the Photo-Secession. And this is how he explained that name Photo-Secession to the president of National Arts Club. Yours truly, in Europe, the moderns call themselves secessionists. So Photo-Secession really hitches up with the art world. And we know what secession means. It's to break away from a bigger body. And I will explain that a little bit more. Now, this is what he said about Photo-Secession. All secessions give is the reason for their moment. The fact that they can no longer tolerate the body from which they detached themselves. A body which exists on conventions and stereotype formula. They stopped all the spirit of originality instead of encouraging them. They refused this ear to any new doctor. Such groups give birth to secession. The Photo-Secession is an active protest against the conservative and reactionary spirit of those whose self-satisfaction imbues them with the idea that existing conditions are akin to perfection. So what he's saying here that he was so fed up with how strong this conservative stream in photography in the US was. Again, promoting the subject matter that was just conventional. We had nudes, landscapes, portraits. He wanted something else. He wanted photography to be accepted as an art form which is equal to other modes of art expression. So the photo-secessionists were against conventional mimicking of painting, and they were also against the idea of perfect representation. So for them, that was not enough. There had to be something more than that to it. So what they promoted was a subjective representation of artists' ideas. And this is one of the art critic reaction to this show, 1902, in which we had the beginning of Photo-Secession. So the art critic said, "We have here merely the excess of diseased imagination which have been fostered by the ravings of a few lunatics." So that kind of shows how outraged people were when Stieglitz wanted to promote photography as a mode of personal expression. For art critics, for painters, for commercial photographers, that was outraging. It is kind of hard for us to understand that because we already accepted that. However, at that time, we have to understand that majority of people, majority of the photographers, were still considering photography to be a mechanical tool only valid to capture reality in the most objective way. And then finally, Stieglitz and Steichen, we will talk about him, opened Gallery 291 in New York that exhibited works of photo-secessionists alongside other artists from all over the world, and which was very interesting because finally we have photographs and painting placed in the same show on the same wall. Photo-secession promoted the controversial viewpoint that what was significant about a photograph was not what was in front of the camera, but the manipulation of the image by the artist photographer to achieve his or her subjective vision. The movement Photo-Secession helped to raise standard and awareness of art photography. So thank you for listening to this week's lecture and make sure to follow further instructions on Blackboard.